The killer paid the ultimate price for his crimes by dying before he ever had to stand in a courtroom. In 1987, a bright young woman in Garden Grove, California, was murdered in her own home. The case went cold for decades until DNA linked the crime to a man who had already taken his own life years earlier. This is the story of Shannon Rose Lloyd and the killer who vanished just long enough to escape justice. In this video, we'll walk through the 1987 murder of Shannon Rose Lloyd, the 1989 killing of Renee Cuevas, and how advances in DNA and investigative genealogy finally exposed the same man behind both crimes. You'll learn how Shannon was found in her Garden Grove bedroom, why the case went cold for over 35 years, how detective work in Las Vegas exposed a different side of the same killer, and how the breakthrough finally came after the suspect had already died by suicide. If you like cold case true crime stories that end with a twist in the investigation, not in the courtroom, stay with me to the end. In May 1987, Shannon Rose Lloyd was a 23-year-old woman living in Garden Grove, Orange County, California. She rented a bedroom in a shared home, quietly going about her life in a comfortable suburban neighborhood. That sense of safety was shattered when members of the household discovered her body in the bedroom one day. Garden Grove police responded to what initially looked like a simple, unresolved death, but the scene quickly pointed to a violent crime. Shannon had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The crime scene evidence suggested this was not a robbery gone wrong, nor a crime of passion between romantic partners. It appeared to be a predatory attack by someone who forced his way into her space. Investigators treated the case as a homicide, began knocking on doors, and collected evidence from the bedroom. They also preserved biological samples from the scene, which, in the 1980s, were put into storage waiting for the right technology to catch up with the questions they raised. But what police didn't know yet would change everything in less than 48 hours. If you're just joining us, this is the story of Shannon Rose Lloyd, a 23-year-old woman murdered in her Garden Grove apartment in 1987, and the killer who would never see a courtroom. So far, we've covered how Shannon was found, how the crime was treated as a homicide, and how samples were saved for the future. Coming up next, we'll look at the 1989 case of Renee Cuevas, and how the same killer struck again, this time leaving behind even more evidence that would one day bust the case open. If you want to see how DNA and family tree DNA hunting finally cracked a 35-year-old double murder, don't skip ahead, stay with me. 3 years after Shannon Rose Lloyd was murdered, another woman in Orange County met a similar fate. Renee Cuevas was killed in 1989. Like Shannon, she was a young woman whose life was ended by a violent predator. The exact details of the scene were not fully disclosed in the press, but the Orange County District Attorney and law enforcement reports confirmed that the same male DNA profile was found at both crime scenes. This meant that the same man had killed Shannon Rose Lloyd in 1987 and Renee Cuevas in 1989. At the time, however, police did not have a match. The DNA profile from both scenes was entered into CODIS, the national DNA database, but no living suspect tested against that profile in the 1980s or 1990s lined up, so both cases were shelved as cold case murders. Detectives in Garden Grove, along with the Orange County Homicide Investigation Team and the Orange County District Attorney's Office, periodically reviewed the files, but without a suspect name or a living person to test, the cases stayed frozen in time. But what police didn't know yet would change everything in less than 48 hours. By now, you've seen how Shannon Rose Lloyd was killed in 1987, and how Renee Cuevas was murdered in 1989, and how both cases were linked by the same DNA. Yet no suspect was ever charged. The killer seemed to have vanished. What happens next is where the story takes a sharp turn, because the trail doesn't lead back to California right away. It leads to a different state, another arrest, and a man who would die long before anyone realized who he really was. If you're here for the forensic twist where DNA finally catches up to a long-dead killer, keep watching. In 1998, Las Vegas authorities arrested a man named Reuben J. in connection with a separate sexual assault and attempted murder case. During that arrest, police collected his DNA. That sample was entered into relevant databases, but at the time, no one connected it to the two Orange County cold case murders from 1987 and 1989. The following year, in July 1999, Reuben J. died by suicide at the age of 39. At that point, he was just another deceased suspect in an unrelated case. The possibility that he might be the same person who killed Shannon and Renee had not yet entered anyone's mind. Over the next 2 decades, cold case teams in Orange County kept revisiting the Lloyd and Cuevas files. Generations of detectives came and went, but the case notes stayed on the shelves. The DNA profile from the 2 scenes remained in the system, untouched. Then, in the early 2020s, investigative genetic genealogy began to change the game. Law enforcement agencies in California partnered with forensic labs that specialized in using public family tree DNA databases to build profiles of unknown suspects. By matching crime scene DNA to distant relatives, they could narrow down the pool of possible suspects and then use conventional records, driver's licenses, obituaries, and police files to identify the one man who fit. When that process was applied to the 1987 and 1989 male DNA profile, the train of DNA relatives led directly to Reuben J. Smith. But what police didn't know yet would change everything in less than 48 hours. You're watching the point where the investigation finally makes the leap from cold case to solved, even though the suspect is already dead. We've just seen how Reuben J. Smith was arrested in Las Vegas in 1998, how he died by suicide in 1999, and how DNA from that case, combined with new genetic genealogy techniques, ultimately tied him to 2 1980s murders in Orange County. What's about to come is the official confirmation, the moment when the Orange County District Attorney and Garden Grove Police publicly announced that the same man was responsible for the deaths of Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas. If you want to see how law enforcement frames this kind of posthumous justice, stay with me. In June 2022, the Orange County District Attorney's Office and the Garden Grove Police Department issued a joint press release officially announcing the resolution of the 2 cold case murders. The release stated that DNA analysis had linked Reuben J. Smith to both the 1987 killing of Shannon Rose Lloyd and the 1989 murder of Renee Cuevas. The same male DNA profile had been found at both scenes and had now been matched to Smith through modern forensic methods. Authorities confirmed that Reuben J. Smith had died by suicide in 1999 before the link to the Orange County murders was ever made. This meant that, while the case was now solved in an investigative sense, there would be no criminal trial, no sentencing, and no prison term. The killer had already taken his own life. Officials emphasized that, although the suspect was deceased, the identification brought closure to the victims' families and to the detectives who had carried the files for decades. The Orange County District Attorney's statement framed the case as proof that justice does not have an expiration date, even if the full legal process could not be completed. Garden Grove Police and the Orange County Homicide Investigation Team praised the work of a multi-agency cold case team, including the California Department of Justice's DNA lab, as essential to the breakthrough. Right now, you've seen the full arc of the case. 1987. Shannon Rose Lloyd is murdered in Garden Grove. 1989. Renee Cuevas is killed in Orange County. 1998 to 1999. Reuben J. Smith is arrested in Las Vegas and later dies by suicide. 2022. DNA and genetic genealogy finally link him to both murders. What's left is the emotional side of the story, the family's relief, the impact on the communities involved, and the eerie reality of a killer who died years before technology exposed him. If you're here for the human side of cold case stories, how victims' loved ones live with answers that come too late, don't leave yet. For the families of Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas, the 2022 announcement brought a mixture of relief, frustration, and grief. On one hand, they finally had a name. For decades, they had lived with the question, who did this? Was it someone who might strike again? Now they knew, the same man had killed both women, and he had already died. On the other hand, that also meant they would never hear the full story from the killer himself, never see him testify, never see him sentenced in a courtroom. The legal system could no longer hold him accountable. Garden Grove Police and the Orange County District Attorney repeatedly stressed that the goal was not only to solve the crimes, but also to honor the victims and bring answers to their loved ones. The press release described the identifications as a tribute to the persistence of detectives who revisited the cases over multiple decades, even when the chances of a breakthrough seemed slim. In interviews, officials also highlighted the broader lesson of the case, that DNA, properly preserved and paired with modern tools, can solve crimes decades after they are committed. The Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas case is now cited as an example of how DNA and investigative genealogy are reshaping cold case work. Biological evidence collected in the 1980s, carefully stored, was enough to generate a full profile once the technology improved. The same DNA profile showed up in multiple unrelated cases, allowing investigators to connect the dots across years and jurisdictions. And when traditional databases failed, family tree DNA tools filled the gap, letting detectives trace the suspect through distant relatives and then confirm his identity using official records. Yet the case also illustrates a limitation of justice in the digital age. It is possible to solve a crime after the killer has died. This shifts the focus from punishment to identification and closure. For viewers, this story raises questions. Should law enforcement agencies do more to preserve biological evidence from unsolved cases, even if there is no immediate suspect? How do families balance the relief of a known name against the pain of knowing their killer will never face trial? In 1987, Shannon Rose Lloyd was murdered in her Garden Grove home. 35 years later, DNA finally named the man responsible, but by then, that man had already taken his own life. Reuben J. Smith was identified as the killer of both Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas, but he died in 1999, long before the connection could be made. The case shows that justice can take many forms. Sometimes it means a courtroom, sometimes it means a file closed with a suspect's name, and sometimes it simply means an answer for the family. If you found this cold case story compelling, like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next case we unlock. And in the comments below, let me know, do you think posthumous identification is enough justice? Or should the system focus more on victims' families than on the killer who is already gone?